Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. The question that's been asked is, my son is addicted to sex and regularly watches porn. What is the Buddha's advice for lay people when it comes to porn and sex? Monks and nuns are celibate as they have the Vinaya rules, but for lay people it's clearly different as we have relationships and families. The precept we take is to refrain from sexual misconduct. Does the Buddha discourage lay people from indulging in porn and sex? And if so, why? So this is a question you don't often find being openly asked, but it's a very important question and one that is probably very useful to many people, both young and old, particularly around celibacy and non-celibacy. And in particular to lay people, it's true, we have families, we have relationships, and we don't take that vow of celibacy, we don't take on that precept. Although, having said that, there are lay people who do take on the precept of celibacy, such as the 8 precepts. And there are also people at the time of the Buddha who were celibate for a very long time. If you remember our session on Nakula Pitta and Nakula Mata, so Nakula's parents, they were celibate for 17 years after having children and taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha. And so they lived as lay people with celibacy. But anyway, to address this question, I think the best way to approach it is to look at a number of things. So let's look at how the Buddha advises all people in relation to the physical nutriment, which is Kabalinkara Hara. Let's also look at the greed path, which is the Lobha path, and how that's connected to sensual desire. And also to highlight the very strong link between when we misapprehend the body and how it brings us back to future rebirth, particularly when it's associated with sensual desire or sensual pleasures. So particularly kamatanha, craving for sensual pleasures. So we'll look at that. I think also it's important to look at this precept of sexual misconduct as well, to ensure that we understand that a little better, and also to see what the Buddha says that can help us in answering this question. One of the first things to say at the outset is that the Buddha didn't ask lay people to refrain from sex, so there wasn't this precept for celibacy for lay people, so that is true. But what the Buddha did say when it came to the 5 precepts for lay people is not to have sexual misconduct. So in that sense, the Buddha's focus was mainly on it's fine to have sex and to procreate. But in answering this question, I think it's really good to look at how we can go the wrong way through misapprehending the physical nutriment. So the physical nutriment can be food, but it can also be the body. And so the first thing that we're going to look at is this physical nutriment, Kabalinkara Hara. So we've covered part of this before, but I think it's useful to look at it in respect of sex and porn. And then also we'll link this to the greed path, because I think this is where it really is quite important in terms of how we are bound to samsara, particularly through form and particularly through misapprehending form, and how vijnana establishes or re-establishes and therefore relinks through form. And then one of the things that we want to look at is what happens when we become addicted to sex or addicted to porn or anything sex related, and what is the result of that. And then as a further look, we'll look at moral shame and sense restraint, why they're important, and then we'll link it to the immeasurable metta. And then we'll have a little bit of a look at celibacy versus non-celibacy, and then also the precept of sexual misconduct. There's a separate talk on the first unprofitable direction. So this is the physical nutriment and going the wrong way through desire. So I'm not going to repeat too much of what's been said there, but I wanted to use aspects of it to help answer this question. And the crux of it really comes down to the perversion that there is attractive in the unattractive. So craving arises when we take delight in form, we welcome it, and we remain holding. So this is the abhinandati, abhivadati, ajosaya, titati. And so when we misapprehend in this way, that we don't take on board the Buddha's teaching about the body really, then we start to develop the wrong perceptions. We develop very strong inclination towards these thoughts around these perceptions. And then what happens is it becomes a deeply embedded view. So when it comes to this body, we see it as attractive rather than unattractive. We see it as fair instead of foul. And so when you look at this, you realize that kayanupassana, mindfulness of the body, in respect of the elements, in respect of the 32 body parts, and many other teachings that the Buddha gives in the suttas around seeing the body correctly. Because if we don't see the body correctly, then we are driven by sensual desire, covetousness, and then lust. And then, of course, consciousness keeps steady on form. And with the breakup of the body, due to going the wrong way through desire, we will want to come and create another form. And that may be due to wanting to have sex, wanting to take delight in sex and anything related to sex. So this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at some of the words of Buddha and the Noble Ones in respect of looking at how we can understand this perversion a little better. If we go to the Petikopadesa, so the Pitaka disclosure, and look at what it says about Subhasanya, what it says is the perception of attractive is that opposite by which the perversion seizes attractive in the unattractive. It has the characteristic of grasping appearance, and its footing is non-restraint of the sense faculties. So clearly what happens here is that we grasp appearance, vana sangahana. So grasping is also like we collect, we gather, we accumulate, or we become very firm or well supported in whatever we're holding on to. And so the appearance, this vana, can be whatever is covering or coating. So this could be the coloring, the luster, the beauty, the likeness, the impression. So what we do with appearance is we grasp something. So when we look at people, we're also looking at how they look, what kind of hair, what kind of clothes, what kind of shape, all that sort of thing. And so when it says that the footing is non-restraint of the sense faculties, we go and look. We go and take the signs and features of what we're looking at. We do the same with ourselves. We look in the mirror and we take the signs and features of how we look. We make assessments. We have preferences around these things. And so that's how we start with the perception of attractive. So we're already taking it in the wrong way. We're looking at the covering of it. So this is something very important to begin with. Now what Buddha has said is that this is a perversion, this is a mental corruption. So what we're seeing is not actually true, it's a lie. And so what he says is the perception of unattractive, this asubhasanya, is that any perception, recognition, determination, acquisition that all living beings and conditioned phenomena are unattractive. So that's what he's recommending that we do, not to take the coating, not to take the appearance, but to really see it as it really is. And so when we do that, the Buddha says that when the perception of unattractive is developed and frequently practiced, the mind does not connect with, does not unite and reference to, does not re-establish or remain on the signs of attractive. So this is the subha nimitta, but establishes on equanimity and repulsiveness, so the unattractiveness. So what he's trying to point to is the truth. Now how can we understand this? Well, we can understand it through a number of suttas. There's a sutta where the Buddha asks us to look at the body as a boil, the Ganda Sutta, where if we see it correctly, we understand that inside of our body there is pus, there is all these things which are impure. There's urine, there's excrement, there's undigested food, all those sorts of things. Even the blood, that you even know that is also a source of impurities. And so when you were to contemplate in that way, it doesn't give you that sign of attractiveness. Likewise, if you were to look at the 32 body parts, each individual part from the outer part of the body with the hair, the skin, all those types of parts, all the way to the insides, the different organs in the body, and all the fluids. And so when you look at it that way, just as a fact, not to make more out of, you understand actually it's not what we think it is. If you remove the clothing, you take off all the makeup, all these sorts of things that we do to decorate the body, then you're left with something that is what it is. And then the Buddha also uses another one around the 9 holes, that if you contemplate that there is stuff that comes out through these 9 holes, so the 2 holes in the eye, the 2 holes from the nostrils, the 2 holes from the ears, 1 from the mouth, 1 from the urine, and 1 for the excrement. So that's 9 holes. So when you contemplate it that way, it's also another way of not seeing simply this coating, this covering, the deception of it. And likewise, when you really understand that the body ages, it gets sick, but particularly with aging, you don't see the body just simply as beauty. So when you see youth, you often misapprehend, but you don't also see the aging process. And so when you look at an older person, you see it, but you don't realize that as you look at each and every person, each and every moment the person is aging. And so Buddha's encouraging us not to misapprehend. And so this can be very helpful. So we'll come to it when it comes to this particular question. So the Pethicopadesa goes on to say that if you do have the perception of unattractive, you have this characteristic of grass being discolored, festering and bloated. So this is charnel ground meditations, but it's also when you don't take it as attractive in the correct way, that you've corrected the corruption in the mind. And so there is rightfully disgust or aversion, this quality of nibbida, that you turn away from it rather than taking delight, welcoming and remaining holding. So when you are indulging in porn, for example, you haven't taken this particular perception. You have the wrong perception. You have the perversion in the mind. So you're always grasping what the Buddha normally calls as subha, the attractiveness, the fair, the beauty. So what the Pethicopadesa says is that if you don't take the perception of unattractive, say that doesn't become established in you, then you incline towards delighting in color and shape. So when it comes to nudity, you're taking the shape of, if you're interested in female form, then the shape of the female form, whatever your preference is. If you're attracted to the male form, similar thing, you're attracted to whatever that your preference is towards that form, and the color of it, and how it appears to you, the luster, and whatever it is that makes it attractive to you. And so what is hidden from you is all these signs of unattractiveness. And so this is a universal thing, that all of us are subject to aging, all of us have 9 holes, all of us actually have impurities in the body, hence why we clean so much. So, and when we die, then the body does become discolored, festering and bloated. Even when we age, we see this. Even when we get sick, we also see this affect the body. And so this is something that is deeply misapprehended when we're addicted to form, to this kablinkara hara, the physical nutriment. So if we quickly run through the physical nutriment from the perspective of the body, and also from the perspective of sexual preferences and getting addicted to sex or porn, then when it comes to the physical nutriment, you keep seeing it as attractive. So you have a craving, you welcome it, you take delight, you welcome, and you remain holding. And so you make more out of physical bodies. You don't see the aging, you don't see the impurities, you don't see the foulness. And so when you do that, you always have the lustful thoughts. So this clinging to sensual desires is really, the mind is imbued with a lot of thinking around sex, around porn. You could be running those things in your mind, what you've seen before, what you've done before. So the bond of sexual desires is you keep fueling that. And so you're always gravitating towards bodies. So you actually lack a lot of sense restraint, because you'll always go and look. If something happens outside, whether it's an animal or a couple, you'll go and look. And when it comes to the body tie of covetousness, you keep seeing the body in the distorted way. And so you always, when you see something you like, that you find attractive, you go, let this be mine. So even when you're watching porn, there's a lot of a sense of, let this be mine, let me enjoy, let me take pleasure from that. And so how you get to the taint of sensual pleasures is there's a strong expectation that you'll experience happiness or pleasure from it, that you can't see the aging nature, you can't see the impurities, you can't see the foulness of the body. You can't let go, basically. So when you get to the flood of sensual desires, you're deceived. Your mind is flooding with the sensuality, and you literally cannot turn back. And so if you keep repeating this process with porn and sex, then it becomes deeply embedded. You become addicted to it. And the point of it is that you have to keep reconstructing it, because the happiness does subside. That once it's ended, you have to reconstruct it again. Why you want to go and watch porn again is the same thing. So the dart of lust is, it's fully embedded in your mind that this body is attractive, and so you want to believe your valuation of it. And so as you age even, you would still go for maybe youth when you watch porn. When you go looking for sexual partners, you would also do the same thing. And so you would want the younger skin, the attractiveness. Even though your body is aging, you would still think from the perspective of seeking youth, seeking that which you find attractive, and however that changes. So there is no restraint at this point. So all the way through, there is no restraint. You keep going back to the body. So whether it's you look at it through porn or you seek it out, and you recreate it in your mind, that's where Vijnana goes to steady. And over again, it keeps recreating lust. And so when that happens, you go the wrong way through desire. Now, what we'll find when we look at the greed path, and you can already see it here, if you were to die at this moment, what would happen is, out of the very strong desire for sex, you would go looking for another existence. And the greed path actually shows how that happens. So we'll look at that next. If you remember, when we looked at any kind of object you take, it leads to the 3 kinds of sense contact, and then the 3 kinds of feeling, but it all ends up in dukkha. So this was the Dittapariyaya Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 35, discourse number 28, but it's also in the Pethakopadesa. But we're going to expand on particularly the greed path. In the Pethakopadesa, it gives a longer insight pathway that helps us to understand this Dhamma. And really what we're looking at is the danger of essentially going the wrong way with sensual desire. That if we mistakenly abide with sensual desire thinking and having the inclination towards sensual desire, particularly with Vijnana establishing on form, then what we get is this result of relinking to samsara over and over again. Now, when it comes to porn and sex, what we're really doing is training ourselves to actually come back to another mother's womb. Essentially, that's what it is. And how this happens is that we start with an agreeable object. So let's assume that we have passed away. And what Vijnana wants to do is establish in what it knows. So it wants to come back to experience sex or porn. And the only way it can do that is through form. So it takes an agreeable object. When it passes away, it's extremely distressed. It doesn't know what's happened. Usually we don't understand when we die. And so we gravitate to what we are most familiar with, what we are craving for. So when you're addicted to sex and porn, your craving is very strong towards the physical body, physical bodies, and to maybe even gravitate towards people having sex. So when you find the sense contact as pleasant, so for example, just like watching porn, when you see a couple having sex, you would go towards it, you would want to make sense contact, you would want to go and have a look. You expect to have pleasant feeling from it. And so you would go towards it with joy, thinking, this is how I can fix it, this will be good. So lust arises just like as you were watching porn or having sex. Lust would arise when you watch a couple having sex. When this happens, sensual desire thinking arises. So when this happens, in the same way, you would be glorifying it, you would be welcoming it, you would be saying, this is great, let me do this again. And so when lust arises, similar to watching porn or having sex, you would then establish your vijnana in the mother's womb. And so this is the danger of how this happens, that if we keep training ourselves in the wrong way, particularly around sex and misapprehending the body, then it's almost like an automatic thing for us to go looking for a mother's womb, to come and experience sex again. Because the only way that one is able to experience it again is actually creating another body. Now, what we don't realize is that one can create another body through an animal and through other lower realms. So that's one of the dangers. We misapprehend thinking that we'll definitely get a human birth, but that is not the case. And when you have very strong desire, it's normally you are bound to lower realms and or the human realm. So it's quite a danger. Now what happens when you get to the constructed characteristic arises is that's when you establish in the womb and you expect to birth. So when you birth, what happens is the painfulness in change, which is the vipranama dukkha, is that you realize, with this body, you're subject to aging again. And then with aging comes death, and then the whole mass of suffering. So that is the whole process. So there's a big danger when it comes to being addicted. And so although the Buddha doesn't say to lay people to be celibate, it's important for lay people to understand this Dhamma so that they don't incline out of wrong view, out of the perversion in the mind about these bodies, and to come back into a mother's womb. We previously looked at Queen Samavati and how she was the foremost at loving kindness. And in that story we heard about Magandiya, who held a grudge against the Buddha. Now Magandiya, she was the beautiful daughter of a Brahmin. And the Brahmin actually was very impressed with the Buddha and offered Magandiya, his daughter, her hand in marriage to the Buddha, and the Buddha rejected this, and after that Magandiya held a grudge against the Buddha, and it was quite serious. But without going into all that, what was interesting about that story, and which something we can understand now, is the words that the Buddha said in relation to when he was offered Magandiya's hand in marriage. And what he said to the parents was that as craving, discontent and lust had been seen, no spark of desire existed for sex. So what would I want with this filled with urine and excrement, that even with a foot I would not wish to touch it? And so this was his reference towards Magandiya. And when you read it fresh, it's actually quite abrupt and quite sharp, like what he actually says. And in many ways, once you understand the gravity, the danger of misapprehending the body, you really understand where the Buddha is coming from when he talks about that. Why would he want Magandiya, who is filled with urine and excrement? So he understands that this body is filled with impurities, and it's not how it's presented on the outside, the covering. If you were to take the skin off all of us, we're left with the skeleton and the organs and everything. That is not attractive. So it's a bit like when we only see skin, and when it's young in particular, we get duped in many ways because we don't see the aging process. And likewise, when we clothe our bodies, dye our hair, put on makeup, spray perfume or cologne, and all those sorts of things, it's very deceptive. And so when Buddha says that even with his foot he wouldn't touch it, it's quite harsh, but at the same time he fully comprehends the danger of going the wrong way with desire, misapprehending form, misapprehending the physical nutriment. One of the things to bear in mind that is important to look at is actually around moral shame. So this quality of hiri. Now, on the non-greed path, we have this healthy moral shame that we really think about, is this something that we would want people to know? Is this something that the noble ones or the Buddha would smile upon or frown upon? And that is almost like a guiding light in terms of qualities. It's actually one of the powers that can come and give us strength. It's a good quality to have. Now, on the greed path, as we remember from the Tayo Dhamma Sutta, which is in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, discourse number 76, we looked at this when we looked at why we are incapable of realizing Nibbana. And if you look at the lust or greed path, what you find is it starts with the lack of moral shame, so this ahiri. When we lack moral shame, this is where we don't feel any shame about what we do. So if you're watching porn or indulging in too much sex or that sort of thing, that your focus is always around the body in the wrong way, then what's not kicking in is moral shame, or if it is, you hide it. So a lot of these things that we do that are probably unskillful or unwholesome or over-intoxicating, over-indulging, we tend to hide it away. And so when it comes to watching porn, people don't openly do it. When people read sexual type magazines or books and stories or watch it, they tend to do it behind closed doors so nobody can see. They even do it behind a VPN, rather than showing it if it's something that they're watching online. It's not something that is so openly talked about. And even sexual preferences and other kinds of orientation, that's also something that is usually hidden. Now, as society has devolved, a lot of these things become more apparent and it becomes more desensitized. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing or an acceptable thing, but from the perspective of the Buddha's teachings, one needs to be very cautious around it. So when you look at the greed path, you see that if you don't have a healthy moral shame, it means that you end up disrespecting the Buddha's teachings, the noble ones. You end up turning away from the Buddha's teachings, so you have more conviction for the world towards, in this case, sex, as opposed to Nibbana or even the teachings that the Buddha says about a good destination. Also, you become quite restless. The mind always wants to feed on what it desires. And so to get out of, even when you experience dukkha, what you would do is you would indulge in sexual thinking. And you would have no desire to see the noble ones. You don't want to be blamed for indulging in these things. So the person that asked the question, your son, for example, would not want to have this conversation with you. Your son would not want to go to see the monks or the nuns at the temple for fear that they would be blamed or admonished for these kinds of bad habits. And then what happens is, because you indulge so much, then what happens is there's a lot of forgetfulness. What do you forget? You forget mindfulness of the body. And so unwise contemplation comes in. You see the body in the wrong way. You keep indulging in it. And so there's a lot of self-view that comes from it. A lot of self-consciousness to one's own body, as well as a lot of taking me and mine from other people's bodies. And so this becomes the lustful, greedy path. And therefore you are bound to birth, aging and death, and the whole mass of suffering. We mentioned before that non-restraint is a huge issue when it comes to guarding ourselves. And if you remember from the Samvara Sutta, we were saying that when we crave, when there's tanha, that we take delight, welcome and remain holding to any kind of sense object through our sense faculties, then we are declining away from the wholesome states. And the Buddha actually calls it, this is a decline. Whereas if we protect ourselves, if we guard against the sense faculties and restrain them, then what happens is we are not declining, we are actually inclining towards wholesome states. So when we realize this, we need to look at what are the areas and means through which we fuel these desires to arise in the mind. And usually it can be through the eye. We read something, we see something, we look at something, or it could be the ear, we hear something, particular music, particular sounds, it triggers something for us. It's through the sense of touch, through the sense of smell and taste, and then also in our mind, which is very powerful. So I think one thing to really pick up on for all of us is to look at the way we are desensitized, the way we develop the wrong view. And so sense restraint becomes very, very important, because if you think about it, movies these days are very sexually explicit, so are TV programs, and even on the news, there's a lot of what's on the news that is very sexually explicit, about crimes and about all kinds of different things, particularly about sexual orientation and all those sorts of things. So the world is deeply imbued with seeing the body the wrong way. And so when you look at magazines, not necessarily porn, but magazines, the way people dress, there's a lot of skin, there's a lot of exposure, there's a lot of showing off the body in a wrong way. Even reading material, a lot of storybooks. The romance industry is very huge, but a lot of it is very sexually explicit now, from what I hear. And a lot of it is put to movies as well, from going from the stories in the books and projected onto the screen. Same with audiobooks and things of that nature. And then when you have the internet becomes something that it makes it readily available to children and also to adults. And so when you have social media inadvertently or even avertedly going towards children's mobile devices with sexually explicit things, then it becomes a huge concern. And so a lot of problems arise from that. And so we need to be very careful how we use our sense faculties and the importance of sense restraint. What we are really saying by heeding the Buddha's teaching is that we don't want to train in the wrong things. So we don't want to go the wrong way with desire time and time again, so that when we come to the ultimate test, we haven't heeded the Buddha's teaching and we end up going the wrong way again, and then coming back into a mother's womb and the whole mess of suffering again. So when we train in the Buddha's teaching, we're really trying to correct our view, really trying to abandon the wrong way with desire, and to protect ourselves. So there's this sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 47, discourse number 20. And it's quite an interesting one because it helps us to look at how important mindfulness of the body is. Because if you really see it correctly, then you have the first foundation, the first establishment that helps the rest of the Satipatthana to unfold. So I'll read it out. It says, Bhikkhus, suppose that on hearing the most beautiful girl of the land, the most beautiful girl of the land, a great crowd of people would assemble. Now that most beautiful girl of the land would dance exquisitely and sing exquisitely. On hearing the most beautiful girl of the land is dancing, the most beautiful girl of the land is dancing or singing. Or an even larger crowd of people would assemble. Then a man would come along, wishing to live, not wishing to die, wishing for happiness, averse to suffering. Someone would say to him, Good man, you must carry around this bowl of oil, filled to the brim between the crowd and the most beautiful girl of the land. A man with a drawn sword will be following right behind you, and wherever you spill even a little of it, right there he will fell your head. What do you think, bhikkhus? Would that man stop attending to that bowl of oil and out of negligence turn his attention outwards? No, venerable sir. I have made up this simile, bhikkhus, in order to convey a meaning. This here is the meaning. The bowl of oil filled to the brim. This is a designation for mindfulness directed to the body. Therefore, bhikkhus, you should train yourselves thus. We will develop and cultivate mindfulness directed to the body, make it our vehicle, make it our basis, stabilize it, exercise ourselves in it, and fully perfect it. Thus, bhikkhus, should you train yourselves. So really, Buddha's highlighting the danger. If you were to have non-restraint of the sense faculties, it's like being beheaded, because you would spill the oil. You would go with the perversion of the mind. And literally, that is what happens, that you would be bound to the death-bound rather than the deathless. Nibbana is the deathless. Coming back to samsara is death, or the pain of death. So this is something that the Buddha uses as a very strong, makes a strong impression on our mind. So if whatever your inclination is, it can be girl or boy, man or woman, in terms of what you're seeking to take as desirable. But in that way, you know, you're holding this oil that you don't want to even drop a single drop of. And in that way, we need to cultivate this kayanupassana, mindfulness of the body. So we mentioned this Itta Dhamma Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, discourse number 73. We looked at this recently in, I think it was looking at how we ruin wealth, because we talked about the obstructions to wealth. And one of the things that, one of the 10 things that is wished for, desired, agreeable, and rarely gained in the world is celibacy. And you can understand why celibacy, if you want to fast track the Noble Eightfold Path, celibacy is something that enables you to fast track for many, many reasons. And hence why when you're a monastic ordained under the Buddha's lineage, you actually take the vow of celibacy as part of Vinaya. So the obstruction to it, which is very interesting, is that the lack of sense restraint is the obstruction to celibacy. So even for lay people, if you want to take 8 precepts, one needs to know that sense restraint is very important. So sense restraint being having the security guard in place over the ear, eyes, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So that means when it comes to things of sexual nature, you don't look at anything of that nature, whether it's movies, TV programs, any kind of thing through the internet to see something, including porn. You don't have anything that entices you through smell, through taste, through touch, and through even sounds. And then on top of that, when it comes to the mind, you guard it. You don't recollect anything, you just simply guard the mind. And so in this way, you can see that when it comes to the form that is held within the Vinaya, sense restraint is very important. And so it's a useful bit of information to know that even when you want to guard from going the wrong way through desire, this is how you do it. You don't make contact with those things that are going to increase one's sexual desire, for example. So one of the things that we really fail to comprehend, but we do experience it, is that when we're driven by greed, so whether it's greed for the body, greed for food, but in this case, if it's pornography or sex, when we're overcome by it, what the Buddha says is, a greedy person overcome by greed intends to hurt themselves, hurt others, and hurt both. They experience mental pain and sadness. When greed has been given up, they don't intend to hurt themselves, hurt others, and hurt both. They don't experience mental pain and sadness. A greedy person does bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. When greed has been given up, they don't do bad things by way of body, speech, and mind. A greedy person doesn't truly understand what's for their own good, the good of another, or the good of both. When greed has been given up, they truly understand what's for their own good, the good of another, or the good of both. Greed is a destroyer of sight, vision, and knowledge. It blocks wisdom. It's on the side of anguish, and it doesn't lead to extinguishment. So this is the Channa Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 3, discourse 71. So this is very important for us to understand. We understand it also through, if we have covetousness, abhijja, then this always leads to domanassa, sadness. So we experience dukkha and domanassa, pain and sadness as a result of coveting, this greedy path. So that's the thing that we must remember, because from sadness we try to fix it again. So when you the person that's addicted to porn, they're addicted for a reason. They're trying to fix unhappiness with sex or pornography. And when anything goes wrong, you turn to it. And even when it changes, when you finish, and at some point even the porn may or may not wear you out, you still turn to it, hoping that you'll be able to lift it again, lift the mind again with desire to find the happiness from it. And you end up being in distress, really, that you end up experiencing pain and then sadness again, and then you keep trying to fix it. So this is something that we must always remember when it comes to the greedy path. So one of the things I wanted to link to was the Karaniya-metta Sutta, because one of the fruits, the path and fruit of the Karaniya-metta Sutta, when you really understand this meditation and the insight pathway within this meditation, where you get to, the insight from this meditation is that when you remove the greed for sensual pleasures, so you no longer have covetousness. And what is this covetousness towards? It's towards the mother's womb. So when we looked at the Lobha path, the greed path that we looked at from the Petikopadesa and Aditapariyaya Sutta, that you won't come back into a mother's womb when you realize and understand the body correctly. That you have mindfulness of the body, you understand it for what it is. It's foul, not fair. It's unattractive, not attractive. It's full of impurities. It's festering, bloated. You have the Asubha Sanya very clearly. It's something that doesn't dupe you. You're not taken with the lie. You see the aging process. So when you give that up, when you've done this whole meditation and you realize the only thing left is covetousness, and if you don't covet coming back into a mother's womb, then you will realize the fruit of non-return. So this is the link to Karaniya-metta Sutta. Now, if you realize more than that, that you realize you don't want to come back to any kind of existence, not even a formless existence. You don't want to experience sukha because you understand that there is no such thing as pleasure in samsara, that it all leads to dukkha. Then you practice for Nibbana, that Nibbana is the only thing. You don't take anything else as me and mine. Then you realize full liberation. So there is a lot of deep Dhamma around this, and also a lot of things to overcome, but you only overcome with right view. And so this is where the Noble Eightfold Path starts to really develop. And so it's a very beautiful teaching from the Buddha, this Karaniya-metta, that when you simply do this wonderful meditation, you really can realize quite deeply not to come back into a mother's womb. If we go to the Sankhittuppasatta Sutta, which is Anguttara Nikaya chapter 8, discourse number 41, it outlines the 8 precepts that one can take for Uppasatta, the full moon poya. And the third one is really this higher precept, which is really what you say is, as long as they live, the Arahants abandon sexual activity and observe celibacy, living apart, abstaining from sexual intercourse, the common person's practice. Today, for this night and day, I too shall abandon the sexual activity and observe celibacy, living apart, abstaining from sexual intercourse, the common person's practice. I shall imitate the Arahants in this respect, and the Uppasatta will be observed by me. This is the third factor it possesses. So there is, when you start to train as a layperson, it's often good from time to time to actually practice this, to take the 8 precepts, or at least live closer to the 8 precepts to deepen the practice. Because mindfulness of the body is established. You don't have the perversion in the mind. So if you are single and this is your choice, this is fine. It's also, if you're married, this is also possible, but it depends on whether you are still at the stage of wanting to have children, then it's slightly different. But if you've reached the stage in your life where it's easy to be celibate, then as a married couple, this is also possible. There are many couples who are living a celibate life, practicing Dhamma. So this is what it means in terms of the 8 precepts at least. So the Buddha actually answers the question about the disadvantages of sex in relation to monastics. And this is in the Tessamateya Sutta in Sutta Nipata, chapter 4, discourse number 7. And it's quite an interesting sutta. I'm not going to go into it in length because I think it's useful to take offline and read for yourself. But clearly the disadvantages are really about keeping on the greed path, letting lust fill the mind, and to also see the body incorrectly, and therefore one becomes quite foolish. So Buddha is always asking to train in right view, to really basically cross over the flood, that you're not taken over by the flood of sensual desire, that you become indifferent to it, that you don't envy people that are still imbued in sensual desire, because that's what happens often as lay people. Where we go wrong is we envy other people's relationships, we envy other people's looks, we envy out of the wrong view, misapprehending the body. And so we get quite depressed over our own bodies as they age, as it can't do what it used to do, or if it's found lacking. And it usually is found lacking from the wrong view. So this sutta actually is quite helpful in looking at what the Buddha says to advise monks, because when you're a monk or a nun, and you particularly are a new monk or nun, and even as you develop on the path, if you're still getting caught with sensual desire, it is a huge problem. And so what needs to really happen is to correct the view and also to increase the amount of sense restraint. And so you don't get tempted, you don't fall into the wrong ways. Although celibacy is not a must for lay people, it does have many benefits in terms of Dhamma practice, because you really, if you understand form, it's a lot easier to be celibate. And at the same time, you're no longer troubled by contacting form in a particular way. And in many ways, there's more honoring of a relationship if you are in a relationship and you've already had children and seen to that aspect of living. But Nakula Pitta, Nakula Mata were one of the role models that we can take in terms of celibacy. In this particular sutta, Nakula Pitta Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 6, discourse number 16, Nakula Mata reveals that when husband was sick and she's counseling him not to worry about her, that they've been celibate for 16 years and they are extremely devoted to each other as partners in Dhamma, partners in life, and supportive of the practice and the Buddha's teaching. And there were other lay people at the time, including Hatthaka of Alavi. And I'm not sure about Chitta, the householder, but potentially he was also celibate. But I recall that Hatthaka of Alavi actually had many wives, and so he was of royalty and he actually let go of all his wives. So it's also possible from that perspective, having wanted to keep a more celibate life. But it's not a must. But there are clear benefits rather than disadvantages in terms of taking the vow of celibacy. And in terms of modern day times, there are lay practitioners now who are married, who are celibate, and they have seen that their practice actually grows and the relationship still sustains itself, but from a place of more honoring, respect, less attachment. Also because when it comes to the point of death, you're ready to let go. You're ready to actually honor what has been lived before and ready to let go, allow the other person to either attain Nibbana or to ascend upwards. And this is something to bear in mind in one's practice as well. One last thing that we should cover is sexual misconduct. So as we said at the beginning, the Buddha laid down in terms of the 5 precepts. If one were to take these 5 precepts, then the 3rd precept is that you would refrain from sexual misconduct. So the Buddha defines this, and we can look at this from the perspective of male or female. So if you have sex with male or female who have guardians, if you have sex with male or female who is protected on principle, or if you have sex with male or female who has a partner, like a husband or a wife, or if you have sex with someone whose violation is punishable by law, So whatever the law stands in terms of age or any kinds of capacity. And then someone who's promised to somebody else. And so that's what falls under sexual misconduct. In the Kamesumicachara Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 56, discourse number 73, the Buddha says that sentient beings who refrain from sexual misconduct are few, while those who don't refrain are many. So what this clearly probably shows is that the misapprehension due to the body causes great harm to ourselves, to others, and it's really only when you comprehend the body correctly, when you have that establishment of mindfulness in the body, then something such as this precept doesn't trouble. But while it is still a problem, then what happens is you gravitate out of desire to break precepts, and this particular one. It's always useful to look at the vipaka kamma, or the result of unwholesome actions. And in this case, the Ducharita Vipaka Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 8, discourse number 40, says that the sexual misconduct repeatedly pursued, developed and cultivated is conducive to hell, to the animal realm, and to the sphere of afflicted spirits. For one reborn as a human being, sexual misconduct at minimum conduces to enmity and rivalry. Now, there's a lot of things that we've gone through, and I would suggest for those who are interested in this question, interested in overcoming the wrong view around this body, understanding the process, how we come to create another body through sensual desire in particular, particularly around sex and sexual desire, then go through this session slowly and take that into your mind. You can even look at the meditation, particularly on the greed path, because that's very, very helpful, alongside also the physical nutriment, looking at how we go the wrong way through desire. Both are very, very useful. And when it comes to someone who is addicted or intoxicated with sex or pornography or romance and the sexual nature of things in romantic stories or in movies and things like that, then I think it's very useful to gradually look at the meditations, particularly when it comes to Asubha Bhavana. And there's one that we're looking at in terms of the medicine to the physical nutriment. We're going to be looking at that on Poya, which is the painful way with slow realization. It's the first doorway to Nibbana. And when we look at it, we really take into our minds this asubha sanya, this perception of unattractiveness, to correct our view. And there are certain things that we spoke about today, such as sense restraint, having that security guard in place, that are very helpful so that we don't go this wrong way. Now, if you're caught in such things like these tendencies, these addictions, this proclivity, then it's very useful to come at it slowly, to disentangle yourself without harming yourself more. The best way is always to come through wisdom, to try and understand it through wisdom, because if you force yourself without knowing why, it's very difficult. If you are the parent of someone who is young and who's addicted, or the partner of someone who's addicted, then it is also very difficult because you can't necessarily push someone to see through this. They have to want it. They have to admit to the pain of continually having to construct, continually having to spend money on pornography or sex or things of sexual nature. And so I think the way to approach it is to gradually see whether the person is interested in the Buddha's teachings. If they're not Buddhist, if they're Buddhist, then it's somewhat a little easier, but not necessarily easy. If it's someone who is young, then it's also to explain these things quite gradually and to ensure that they know that although there is what is perceived as gratification, but to understand also that there is a danger in it, particularly through social media and desensitizing ourselves to things of sexual nature. And then also to, if possible, if they are open to it, to actually look at this greed path, because it's very, very powerful. Because if we continue to train ourselves in this wrong kind of tendency, then it automatically makes it so easy at the final exam to replicate the same tendency again. We've trained ourselves down the wrong path. And so when you take the Buddha's teaching into mind, you're really trying to train yourself out of that, because that is what we have done time and time again. So to end this session, I wanted to end on an upbeat note. So I wanted to look at the Kimatthaya Sutta in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 11, discourse number 1. And it's really around having skillful virtue. So when we refrain from sexual misconduct, when we refrain from overindulging in things that intoxicate the mind in a perverse way, in a corrupted way, out of wrong view, when we refrain from that and we can say that our conduct is good, that it's been skillful, then this teaching is very useful for that, because it brings great joy to the mind. So this is a conversation between the Buddha and Venerable Ananda. And so the Buddha says, "So Ananda, the purpose and benefit of skillful virtue is not having regrets. Joy is the purpose and benefit of not having regrets. Rapture is the purpose and benefit of joy. Tranquility is the purpose and benefit of rapture. Bliss is the purpose and benefit of tranquility. Concentration is the purpose and benefit of bliss. Truly knowing and seeing is the purpose and benefit of concentration. Disillusionment is the purpose and benefit of truly knowing and seeing. Dispassion is the purpose and benefit of disillusionment. And knowledge and vision of freedom is the purpose and benefit of dispassion." So Ananda, skillful virtue progressively leads up to the highest. And so when we realize that we are cultivating the right virtue, so there's no sexual misconduct, there's no overindulgence in the wrong things, we know that we are correcting the view and we are not coveting things out of the wrong view, therefore we can expect this insight pathway, that out of that we have no regrets. No regrets, then there is joy that arises. When joy arises, rapture arises. When rapture arises, tranquility. After tranquility, there's bliss, then concentration. Then we truly know and see with wisdom. So there's disillusionment with the world, and then we have dispassion towards the world. We turn away from it because it is deceptive and lying. And therefore we have knowledge and freedom, or knowledge and vision of freedom, of liberation. We take Nibbana as our goal, as our truth. And so when we delight in having virtue, this is something that we progressively develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So I'd like to end here with this final teaching from the Buddha, an encouragement that not to despair, but to gradually understand the teachings of the Buddha, particularly when it comes to sensual desire. And let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.